Climate change is affecting Boston and communities around the world. Sea level rise and extreme precipitation threaten our Charles River ecosystem in the very place that the Museum of Science is located on. The impacts aren't the same for everyone. We need to think carefully about how to keep communities resilient, cool, and connected in ways that allow us to make our communities better and safer for everyone. Climate change is happening now. The Museum of Science is working to facilitate a conversation about this that includes you. Here at the Museum of Science, we want to change climate change.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Ritchie, president of the Museum of Science. We are so proud to be a sponsor of this community discussion of Adam McKay's biting satire, Don't Look Up. What a great film to talk about the big existential challenges we face as a species. One of the challenges for all of us as people is whether we will just bury our heads in the sand when we see a challenge coming, or whether we will understand that we have been given the ability to rise up to the challenges we face, and that science and technology gives us the tools we need to solve the problems we are facing. At the Museum of Science, we are committed to being relevant to the big science issues of our day, whether it's a public health question like the COVID crisis, or whether it's climate change, or how we effectively understand and use artificial intelligence. These are the things that will define our future. These are the things that matter to our community and to the world, and therefore these are the things that matter to us. We hope you will come to the museum and join in that conversation, raise your provocative questions, bring your point of view, because together we have to use these things to rise up to all of the challenges we face. Science should be our common ground, not a political battleground. So Don't Look Up is a great way to frame this conversation, and I look forward to the conversation that is to come.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is David Abel. I am a reporter at the Boston Globe, and I've been covering climate change and environmental issues for the paper and as a documentary filmmaker for more than a decade. And I hope you've seen some of my films, which include Sacred Cod, Lobster War, and most recently Entangled. When I took over the environment beat at the Globe, I learned quickly that there wasn't much of a sincere debate about whether humans were causing the planet to warm, even if some loud voices insisted on calling climate change a hoax or other nonsense. Over time, I realized that part of my job was to show how climate change wasn't an ideological point of view or some distant abstract threat, but that it was playing out in real time, affecting real people, often the most vulnerable among us. I now think it's fair to say that climate change is the most important story of our time. And here's why. The math, to be frank, isn't looking good. If we don't stop burning fossil fuels soon, global average temperatures are likely to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times within as soon as a decade. As of now, according to the latest reports by the United Nations, we're on track to an increase of temperatures of nearly 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. To put those seemingly abstract numbers in context, today we already have a third more carbon in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, and perhaps as long as 15 million years, depending on the estimate. And that's before humans existed and when oceans were more than 100 feet higher than they are today. In his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, the journalist David Wallace Wells describes what the difference of a few degrees of warming will likely mean. At 2 degrees of warming, he writes, the world's major ice sheets will start to collapse. Some 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity. Major cities along the equator will become too hot or too humid to live in, and heat waves could kill thousands of people every summer, even in northern latitudes. At 3 degrees, he writes, extreme droughts will become permanent throughout large parts of the world. Areas burned by wildfires in the United States will be 6 times larger than they are today. Hunger will increase and crops will fail. Rising seas will inundate coastal cities. Storms will become far more destructive. Conflicts over resources, will likely lead to more wars, and ultimately, many more people are likely to die, and as many as 1 million species could go extinct. It's worse, much worse than you think, Wallace Wells wrote. Warming of 3 or 3.5 degrees would unleash suffering beyond anything that humans have ever experienced. And if you think this isn't a problem that might hit home, you should know that Boston last year registered its highest temperatures ever recorded, while 7 of the city's 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2010. In fact, as we reported in the paper a few months ago, the Northeast is warming at a faster rate than much of the rest of the planet. The effects of that warming have already become clear throughout our region, and especially in our coastal waters. The Gulf of Maine has been warming faster than just about any other large body of water on the planet, and is just one example of the impact of that warming. In the waters just off southern New England, the lobster catch has plummeted by more than 90%. We've seen our iconic cod species collapse as well. Now it stands at about 4% of what's considered a sustainable catch. And it collapsed so much that the federal government, less than a decade ago, declared a moratorium on cod fishing, which was previously unthinkable. There are many other such examples. That all said, the worst case scenarios of climate change don't have to happen. If we sharply reduce our emissions now and in the coming decades, we could limit the amount of warming that takes place. That's why journalists and filmmakers have a growing responsibility to call attention to our failures to curb our carbon emissions, as well as cast light on things like greenwashing and other efforts that pretend to be real action. Ultimately, our job is to remind the public, policymakers, and politicians about what we can and must do to correct our course. That is all a long-winded lead-in to say that's what drove me and drew my interest to having this conversation about this really captivating film, Don't Look Up, which apparently I recently learned is the most watched film ever streamed on Netflix, and has also been nominated for 4 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Screenplay. Without ever mentioning the words climate change or global warming, the film paints, I would say, a devastating portrait of how ideology can pervert facts, misinformation can corrupt truth, and our constant stream of puffery, myopia, conspiracy theories, and outright propaganda via social media, TV news, and other platforms have made it so difficult for us to find common ground on even the most existential issues we're facing. So, joining me to discuss the questions this film raises and how we might address them, including here in Boston and elsewhere on a local level, are the Reverend Maria White Hammond, who's Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Spaces in Boston and the founding pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester. She's also a fellow with the Green Justice Coalition, which brings together environmental justice groups from around Massachusetts. Also joining us is Ron Suskind, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, best-selling author of many great books, and the producer of award-winning documentaries, one of which I should say left me in tears of joy watching. Importantly, Ron, who's someone I've admired for years as a fellow journalist, also served as co-producer of Don't Look Up. Okay, I'm going to start off by asking you guys a few questions, and then we will take some questions from the audience. And I apologize for that long wind up. Ron, let's start off with you. Tell us, if you could, why you wanted to get involved in making this film, and now that it's been out for several months, what surprised you the most about the response to it?
Okay, this film, David, starts in a conversation that Adam McKay and I had in 2018 at Sony. I was helping out with his previous movie, Vice, the Dick Cheney movie. As you know from some of my books, I'm kind of an expert on Cheney. I wrote a couple of books on the big man, and we had finished it, and we were sort of talking to each other about this sort of nice way we have together. He said, Ron, your books are very cinematic. And I said, yeah, well, cinema works. So I'm copying what you all do in narrative nonfiction. And we said, how can we go at the great issue of this time, which is climate change? And that began a discussion. And a discussion in which we ranged around in a lot of directions as to how to get people in the room and hear the term climate change, or to feel the reality of climate change, maybe without even mentioning the words climate change, because we understood as soon as you say it, people flee from the theater, turn the channel, say, please no, please no. So that was the beginning of the discussion. Not long after that, Adam was on the phone with an interesting guy named David Sirota, who's a journalist, kind of political journalist. He was chief speechwriter for Bernie Sanders, if you want to kind of place it politically. And Sirota was ranting to McKay, climate change is insane. It's like there's a giant asteroid headed to Earth and no one gives a whatever. And Adam's like, that's it, that's it. That's why he's Adam McKay. He's always looking for a way to do cinema. And the light goes off, the light bell, and he calls me up and says, I think I've got it. And we began a discussion through 2019 of just how to architect this, how to build out this script with an asteroid headed for Earth in 6 months, 3 days, 10 hours, 4 minutes, whatever the number was at the beginning. And that's how the movie came to be. It was a really interesting process that ranged very widely to try to tell a story of this time that allowed us to see how we got into such a terrible fix when it came to this existential crisis that seems to be growing profoundly worse without the remedy of human beings to save their, as my grandmother would say, their shared tuchus. And so that was the movie. And it's a fascinating process of going through the year of riffing with McKay, which sometimes I'm like, we should just sell tickets to this. McKay is a brilliantly funny, creative character. Just a little capsule bio, McKay, head writer of Saturday Night Live, kind of a king of improv, who matched up with Will Ferrell, who was one of the cast members when Adam was the writer. They made a bunch of movies, you know, Anchorman, Talladega Nights, other guys, Step Brothers. And then McKay took a little turn where he said, I'm going to do a different kind of movie, and did The Big Short from Michael Lewis's best-selling book. And he did all sorts of interesting things with that, won an Academy Award, then Vice, then Don't Look Up. And now Adam and I actually are working on another movie. So that's how it happened.
Well, I want to hear about that. And I also want to hear a little bit more about, you know, what surprised you about the response to this and how it's changed over the last few months. We'll come back to that.
Great.
Rev Maria, so glad you are with us and have survived what I heard is some kind of ankle injury. I hope you're okay.
Yeah, I was scuba diving with sharks and I did fine with the sharks, but then I fell on the boat.
Oh my God.
That's good.
I love that irony. Wow. Well, I hope you're actually mobile and you're on your feet.
Well, I'm in a boot, so that's the best I'm going to do for the next month. So.
Okay, well, hang in there. So I just wanted to ask you why or how did this film speak to you? What was it ultimately that resonated with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a number of things I'll say about the film that I think are both, you know, resonant about the film and then really effective, in my opinion, for those of us who do a lot of work in climate to really think about. I mean, I think one of the key things is that it was hilarious. And, you know, the reality is that every morning I get an email, actually I get multiple emails. I get the WAPO email and the New York Times email and, you know, telling me what's going on with climate. And if you read those things enough.
And the Boston Globe emails. Right?
I do. Yes, I do. I also get, although there is a problem because I changed my email address, but that's a side note. I will make sure I get that fixed. My newsletters are not coming to my new email. But anyway, I get these emails sort of laying out what what is happening in climate. And the truth is, it's often really discouraging. And so if you are moving in this space on a really, really regular basis, it can be a space that's somewhat depressing. And I think that the movie does not shy away from the reality of the crisis, but it inserts a level of absurdity that allows you a bit of levity, an ability to laugh about the craziness of the situation. And I think that's really important. I watched it with my family pretty soon after it came out. And so I think that we really do have to figure out in the climate world how we are honest with people about something that should make us all petrified, but do it in a way that people are emotionally able to process. And I think one of the key things about the film is something that I've sort of sensed from the beginning. I mean, one of the reasons I work in this as a pastor and now as a government official, which is that's more relatively recent, but is that I really believe this is a socio-spiritual problem, that we have lived our lives in a certain way with the assumption that no one would ever call our card on it, that we could use up. Resources are endless. I mean, it's the same way like children function, right? Because their parent has always been giving to them, often they don't always think about what does it take for this to be available to me. I come home and there's dinner. I don't necessarily think about what it takes for my parent to put that dinner on the table. Now, not all the children have the luxury of that kind of bubble. There are kids who see the realities that their parents are struggling with, but we as a nation specifically, and to some extent the rest of the world, are at a point of reckoning with the way that we've been living is not viable anymore. And my perspective, I often say, it's not just about the parts per million in the atmosphere or saving the planet. If the planet is our only home, we actually share it with a bunch of other species and a bunch of other beings. And we are the absolute worst house guest ever. We take a dump in the bathroom and don't flush it. We eat other people's stuff out of the refrigerator and we're like, oh, was that yours? Our rooms look like a disaster. And rather than clean them up, we just move to another room. I mean, that's how we're behaving. And that way of being is not sustainable. It cannot just be, renewable, charged onto some other fuel. We have got to change the way we function, or else, to be honest with you, we don't deserve to stay. And I think I thought that the movie did a really good job of not just talking, in fact, climate change is never mentioned. It actually really focuses on the behaviors of how we live and how absurd it is. And from my perspective, it is a call to a mass maturity program. Like, human beings don't just need to put the right policies in place or find some alternate fuels. We need to grow up. We need to change and evolve and do better and be better. And I think I really appreciated that. From my perspective, it pointed a light on that. And it's also pretty interesting because the pandemic has not been our finest moment.
Well, I just want to jump in and ask you about your experience now as a public official, but also as a reverend in terms of dealing with some of the people who are portrayed, the don't look up people in the film. How often do you meet folks who doubt that climate change is happening or that humans are the cause of our accelerating warming? And how do you talk to people like that? Do you engage them? Do you try to persuade them?
Sometimes I still do. I was just on the scuba diving trip and there was somebody there that was like, I don't know about climate change. And from my perspective, the number of people that are like that is small. But I think at the end of the day, my frustration is not with the people who won't look up. It's the people who look up and rather than doing something about it, spend all their time focusing on the other people that won't look up. If 50% of us are looking up and realize that something is wrong, we should be mobilizing, shifting, changing, pushing at a level that it would be undeniable to the other folks. And so like, there is this thing where, you know, it's like, there's the climate deniers, and then there's the climate believers who spend most of their time yelling at the climate deniers. And I'm like, we don't have time to be yelling at those folks. We need to actually be leaning into what are the creative solutions? What sacrifices are we willing to make? How are we willing to change our structures? What are we willing to work for and do differently to address this crisis? Because if we spend all of our time waiting for everybody to agree that the asteroid is coming, like that moment is past. There's enough people who believe that if we were mobilizing on the level that we could and should be, we should be able to do something effective, regardless of how many deniers are out there.
Ron, to me, the film was less about climate change than it was about our increasing ability to manufacture alternative facts as much as alternative worldviews in which truth is more a matter of belief than empirical reality. It seemed, as we have discussed before, that the film could be as much about the pandemic as it is about the war, as it might be about the war in Ukraine. What was the rationale for not using the words climate change in the film? And do you worry that too many people might somehow miss the point? Is there any evidence that may have happened? That it was in some ways like more of an entertainment than a statement?
Well, if there was the threat of that, it vanished quickly when the movie came out, because it just created a firestorm of debate and argument and back and forth, the likes of which I don't think I've ever seen around a movie, where people were attacking each other for criticizing the movie or not criticizing it. The climate deniers mostly were quiet. It's actually a smaller group than it has been over the past few years. I think they're shrinking. But then you've got the kind of climate change activists and scientists attacking the movie reviewers who didn't like the movie. They're like, you're our enemy. And so I think quickly it was clear this was about climate, but in a way that pointed a mirror on us, on our behavior. But Mariama, I just love just every single thing you just said. I love you. I'm just so happy to be on a panel with you. You were just so eloquent. I mean, the mass maturity issue. The fact is that we are stunted in this society in ways. I feel like summoning the ghost of George Marshall and Ike and all those World War II types who are like, let's go. Let's move in shared purpose to go head on and maybe even sacrifice ourselves for the greater good. McKay and I exchange a clip a lot, which is, of course, that great scene from Saving Private Ryan, where Tom Hanks is there and he says, I'm a teacher, a common man doing something for the greater good, heroic, for shared purpose, and maybe even meaning his own sacrifice. We are in a situation like that, where that kind of maturity of a society that is not getting distracted, not engaging in foolish arguments, realizing we're in an emergency. I mean, we just are so desperate for it. So that's what we pointed the mirror at everything, including, of course, this just profound problem of dis and misinformation that we're living with every hour of every day. I mean, I've been at this for a long time. I've written 6 books. The reality-based community, that phrase is from a New York Times piece I wrote in 2004 when they were inventing weapons of mass destruction and these causes for war, and they knew it. The fact is, if we can't agree on fundamental truths that the sun rises in the east, there's nothing to discuss. There's no beginning point. And right now, we continue to struggle with the power and, frankly, the profitability of mis and disinformation. And as somebody like David, who has spent his whole life trying to assemble and contextualize and offer verifiable truths, It is a time in which the world is literally spun on its head, where I've been in arguments with people and I'm like, how could you possibly believe that? What's the source of that insanity that you've embraced? That's a big part of what the movie is about as well, which does get us to climate change, that does get us to pandemic, that gets us to madness over what causes the storming of our Capitol. All of those issues are there for us to see through shtick. As Mariama says, laughter is so powerful. There's a reason the dictators first arrest the comedians. If they're laughing at you in that little hat you're wearing and maybe the funny mustache, you're in big trouble. And so
that
Adam,
might,
of course,
might explain Vladimir Putin's extreme antipathy for Vladimir Zelensky.
I mean, the idea of Putin up against a Jewish comedian is, I mean, you couldn't write a book or make a movie with more powerful shtick than that. So, I mean, so that's a part of really at the center of what the movie was trying to show us at this time, and holding the mirror up to everyone in an equal opportunity takedown. I mean, no one kind of gets out alive here. We go at every segment of society. There's no one who is pure and immune and holy.
And I want to come back to that issue in a bit, but I just want to take this closer and more back home to climate change. So Rev Maria, I want to ask you to get on your soapbox for a minute here and help us understand as we as a society and a planet continue to go in the wrong direction, increasing our carbon emissions actually when we need to be reducing them. In your view, can you share with folks listening in, what's the solution to getting us to move back in the right direction? And more specifically, what can and should we be doing as a city? Is there anything we can be doing as individuals to make a difference?
So, I mean, I think that from the big picture, when people ask me the work I do, I always say that I do ecological justice work. And that's not a rejection of any climate justice or environment. That's not a rejection of anybody else's term. It's just how I look at it. And that's because ecology is the study of home, eco, coming from the Greek word oikos, meaning home, right? The study of home, the understanding that we live in a system that's interconnected, and we are just one part of it, right? The problem that I have, and as I said, we are the worst house guest ever, right? So we're in this home, we're treating it like crap. From my perspective, the core problem is that our economy, which means management of home, has no relationship with our ecology. And we've created a whole way of being like, well, people will say to me like, oh, well, we can't do that because we can't afford it. Like, we can't afford not to. We have no other home. I know Richard Branson and like Elon Musk are trying to get on fights and try to figure out how to go. But all they can do is go up and come down. They haven't really figured out how we're going to live somewhere else. So this is the only home we have. The notion that we cannot afford to sustain our ability to survive here. I just don't know any other species that thinks in that disordered way. So I think from my perspective, we've got to get an alignment between where we spend our resources and what it takes to survive in the long term. And that is like the big picture shift in our thinking away from like short-term profits and like, what can I get now? That if we don't do that, we will not behave differently. We will not address the climate crisis adequately. And I think, to be honest with you, I mean, a lot of where I look at that, I look at the value systems that drove Native American communities and continue to drive Native American communities, value systems from the African nations that I don't know exactly where I'm from, but I know that, West Africa and Southern Central Africa had different ways of understanding how you're supposed to be in relationship with the planet, and sort of whether or not humans are supposed to have this like ultimate power to control things, or whether they are one group among many sharing this space. So I do want to say, I mean, I know that sounds like fluffy, but I functionally believe if our approach doesn't change, we will keep making the same bad decisions. And I remember when my dad, like when I was a kid, I would get in trouble, and I always had a reason why this thing that I did this time was not the same as the thing that my dad brought up that I did like a month ago. And I'd be like, you're just trying to like make connections where there's not any, and you're not being fair, and you're not forgiving me for the past. And my dad would be like, there's a pattern here that I'm trying to get you to see. And so I think we do need to recognize those patterns. That being said, I think when we function from a different system, it actually creates a lot of opportunities that I think are really exciting. So for instance, a lot of what we look at when we're looking at policy at the city or in other groups that have been is there a way to reduce our emissions, to deal with some levels of pollution, and to actually change who we put at the front of the line for the benefits? Because a lot of environmental injustices are because certain people get all the benefits and other people get all the burdens. If we start radically shifting that, if we start saying, let's put a power plant in Wellesley, you know what I know? We won't need no more power plants. You want to put a power plant in Wellesley? We will suddenly be all about renewable energy. You start saying we're gonna do trash incineration, we're gonna let that count as renewable energy, and we plan to put it in Lexington, you will start seeing innovations, Brookline, new ways of doing things. So if we start shifting who has to bear the burdens, it's going to be amazing how we suddenly find ways to eliminate these things that we've been willing to allow to proliferate over time. And so a lot of the things we've been doing, for instance, we passed a policy last year called BERDO, the Building Emissions Reporting and Disclosure. But basically we said, if we're going to go to net zero, then we should start planning right now. We should not wait and hope that some technology is going to come out of the cloud in 2040 and fix it all. Let's put a plan together. Let's say, where do you need to be in 2025? Where do you need to be in 2030? And you know what? We need market solutions that are affordable for people. So you know what? We're going to ask our buildings, our big buildings, our biggest developers, you get out there and set the market. You get out there and decarbonize your buildings so that you're going to drive the prices down for the smaller buildings, for the nonprofits, for all the other people that did not make $1 million off an 1,000 square foot, luxury condo. Because those who have the most should lead us. They can help set the market in such a way that it makes it really affordable for everyone else. So I think that when you put the ecological and the economic things together, you actually create opportunities for new people to start saying, you know what, I think we could eliminate emissions because I don't want them next to my $2 million home. And not that businesses are in love with.
Let me just stop you off. Let me just stop you 1 second and just say, is there's somewhat of a divide when you talk to climate scientists about how much we should be talking about individual solutions versus sort of societal steps and policies and changes. And I'm just wondering, as a reverend, as a city official, how do you answer the question when people, I'm sure, raise it to you, like, what can I do? And I'm sure a lot of people here listening in are wondering, is it practical to think that, me, David Abel, resident of Boston, there's something I can practically do except not voting for people who, think climate change is a hoax?
Yeah, so I don't think it's either or. It's a definite both and. Because there are things you can do as an individual, and there are limitations to what you can do as an individual if the policy climate doesn't allow certain things to be possible. So for instance, a way that it works together in Boston. So we have this competitive community choice energy, right? And that was a policy that a group of us worked for that said, let's allow the city to go out and bulk purchase more renewable energy into our electric supply. And we have 3 different levels. You can choose the most basic level that's cheaper. You can choose a standard level that's more renewables than what you would get if you were in Eversource, but more affordable. Or you can go to 100% clean energy. This policy is great because it is accessible to every single Bostonian, no matter what their income level. There are options for all of them. And if you have the financial privilege to be able to afford 100% clean energy, you absolutely should. Now, right about now, our 100% clean energy is still cheaper than Eversource's basic energy. So that's something I'm really excited about, because I've been working on that before I was a government official, back when I was on the community advisory board working on it. So that's an example of where the policy created new options for people that they couldn't have gotten before. And then if you have the ability, you should be opting up. You should be driving how much resources we have so that we can be pulling in more renewable energy. If you can be on the front end of like electric vehicles, great. It will make it more possible for other people to access them. But it's not an either or. Just making personal consumption decisions does not necessarily make it accessible to everybody else. And there are some kinds of emissions, in fact, many of the emissions from, companies or from sort of large systems, that individuals don't have the ability to sort of influence just by personal choice. And so it's absolutely important to do that personal choice work, because how are you going to come and tell somebody else they should be making a sacrifice? How do you go to the CEO and say you should be doing something different if you're not doing it yourself? So I think it's also about being consistent, not asking other people to make sacrifices that you're not willing to make, but it's not an either or.
Great. I've mulled that question quite a bit and asked that question to a lot of people over the last few years, and that was maybe the best answer I've heard. So thanks. That's pretty tangible. Ron, coming back to the film, now that you've had a few months to let it sort of settle in, and well beyond that, because I'm sure you saw lots of cuts as they were being, as it was being made. Do you have any like dissident opinions about the film? Or do you have any problems with how it was put together? For example, do you think the media was portrayed fairly? Do you think we're really that shallow or oblivious? And if there's anything you would change about it, what would you change?
Well, I kept my hands kind of off a little bit, the media part. I read the script, but I didn't want to almost like exert undue and self-interested influence over that part. I thought they were a little tough on the media, but they're tough on everyone. And that moment when they're sitting in what is ostensibly the New York Times offices, and they're looking at the effect of the story and the effect of their appearance, and they're saying they didn't move the needle at all on social media and on digital, I'm like, there it is. I mean, it couldn't be clearer. We in the truth business have been ravaged in this time as our business model has essentially collapsed, and we're struggling. We've got a couple big battleships. But, also that part where the White House is denying that there was even a meeting, and you're dealing with that as well. And often the media doesn't have a strong response when people in this year, not when I'm a younger reporter, frankly, but in this time, they just lie. They're just like, no, the sun rises in the west. I wasn't even on Earth that day. And there was a time where people just say, don't lie in public. Don't lie to a reporter, God knows. It'll bite you. That's over. And all of that was rendered, and also often the ineffectual nature of what the media can do. When it comes to the movie, in any movie, there are parts where you're like, I don't know, or that part we should have done something else too, or that worked okay. I thought it would work better. On balance, though, I think this movie was surprisingly effective across the board. I've sat with lots of audience watching it, and they get it. They laugh.
Do you think if there was literally a comet or an asteroid coming for the planet, though, do you think we would be that absurdist. I mean, obviously there are all kinds of corners of our world that would come apart at the seams, as they do in many crises. But I mean, I'd like to think at least that there is there's a cadre of sober-minded people that, could command the attention of our media, of the likes of Ron Suskind, in real, in the real world, who command serious journalism and serious, treatment of, life-changing events.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I hope there are people like that. I trust they are somewhere. Look, it's shtick, it's satire, it's parody.
Yeah.
And that's why it worked, actually. We're going to extremists. We're taking the bit of something and really running with it. And you're like, oh my God, that is what it is. I mean, Meryl Streep in the Oval Office, she is so brilliant at improv. One of the things, just in terms of watching the movie, we shot the whole script. That was basically in the contract. Everyone kind of read and did their parts. And then it was just improv city. People just went for it. And McKay is like a known genius of improv. There's a guy, Del Close, who's kind of the inventor of improv in America. McKay's one of his, you see there's a documentary about him these days. And McKay just unleashed the actors. Meryl Streep, if you want to see something great, go on YouTube and type in Meryl Streep in improv. There's a part in that scene in the Oval Office where she's on the phone. She did 21 or 22 improvs of that in a row. It's unheard of. I mean, I thought you got the test. You didn't get the test? Oh God, I should go now. And then she's literally going one after another. That's why the movie has a kind of energy to it. Now, a part that I think really made it kind of hit, though, was this idea we had that it should be shtick until it's not. It should be parody. And then about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, it will cease to be. The characters are going to be drawn sharply to make their points, to deliver their bit of dark humor. But then you'll meet us in full 3 dimensions, each of us. And the end of the movie, in a way, the star of the finish of the movie is Timothée Chalamet, the faith-based character, which I think was a key addition. Now, obviously, that was one I was sort of deeply involved in, but I've spent a long time in America on the coastlines, but also in the wide middle, talking to, there's 100 million faith-based people in the United States. They don't get, I don't think, sufficient currency in the rendering in the world in which we're seeing and living. And that character at the end who says that prayer, Timothée Chalamet, had enormous effect. I think one of the things that was interesting hearing audiences watch it is people wept. They're laughing through much of the movie. And at the end, they wept. And some of the reviewers were people, David, you and I know, very smug and worldwide coastals, wept as well. And they were deeply concerned, confused, and troubled by that. I can almost see them sitting there going, oh boy, oh no, what's happening? And why am I crying when someone's praying? That's not something I do. Some of them actually had pretty nasty reviews of the movie. I think that's what drove it. But I think what was important was that everybody was seen fully in their humanity at the finish before we killed them all off. Because that was the key,
including the president, Meryl Streep, who gets eaten by the bird at the end.
The Bronteroc, yeah, 22,740 years in the future.
Yes, nobody was weeping for her.
Right. And there's some people who are like, please, someone eat that person, get a Bronteroc to eat her. But that moment when all of your loved ones, I mean, look, these stars are deep in the global and American consciousness. People feel strong things about Meryl and Leo and Jen, and to kill them all together in an instant left the theaters silent, and people on their couch as well. And they say, my, we really are up against it, aren't we? Which is just what Mariama and I were all talking about, that shaking moment of maturity, of reality, break out of the noise and the haste and the distraction you're living. You're being pulled in 1,000 directions by the way the media works today. We've never experienced this quite the way we do now. But here it is. This is the existential crisis, and you're in the thick of it. What will you do? And I think that's what the movie kind of does. It sounds an alarm. Now the questions that emerge from all the discussions across many of the traditional unbreakable or uncrossable borders, in fact, were very, very much, what do we do? More than I've heard up to now. What the devil do we do about this thing that I'm now feeling, not just thinking, but feeling as Earth is destroyed, and knowing that we are steadily and slowly destroying it as we sit.
So I want to bring this back closer to home. And Rev Mariama, I've been working on a new documentary about that I would say has some parallels to Don't Look Up. It's about a place where people have spent the past decade building along the coast at sea level, on landfill, arguably in the bullseye of rising sea levels. They've done this despite warnings from scientists that this place will eventually be inundated by a major storm, and the fact that there's more high tide flooding in this particular area than in any other city in the country. Still, billions of taxpayer dollars have poured into this place, continuing to build it up. As you probably know, I'm referring to the seaport in Boston. And I'm just wondering why we're still building there. And do you see any parallels to Don't Look Up?
So Damon, I don't gamble, but I officially have won a bet that I knew you could not get through this without trying to get me to say something to you about the seaport. And what I'm going to say is, I did not make those decisions. So I won't take responsibility for them.
Okay.
I feel like this is a scene from Don't Look Up, Mariama.
Had I been consulted.
Oh, I see. Had
I been consulted.
Bring it.
That neighborhood probably would not exist.
Wow.
And that is what I'm willing to say. I mean, I think in light of that, and not just there, I mean, I think we got a number of places. We got 47 miles of coastline in the city of Boston. The fact that we at one point had no idea that climate change was an issue and built in some places is one thing. If we continue to do it, well, then shame on us. And that's what I'm willing to say.
Mariam, let me ask you a question. I mean, I've dealt with this often, these issues of denial, these issues of confidence, of not backing off.
Mhm.
Just keep moving forward. As soon as you begin to back off, there often is the threat of collapse, of retreat. And all of a sudden, people, especially folks who deal with markets and finance and the rest, go, oh, now we're running for our lives in the other direction. And they hold that line. It's amazing. It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
And the question is kind of when you hit that tipping point where they're like, I'm out of here. I mean, look at Florida. Look at so many parts of the country. Look at the fact that how can you possibly get insurance at this point? 30-year coverage. At some point, the insurers are going to go, we're out of here. You can't insure any properties anymore in Florida, certainly. And I think on the coastlines of much of the East Coast and the West Coast.
Well, I think
get there.
I can say this, and again, now I'm a government official, I have to parse my words, but I will say this from a spiritual perspective. It is saddening to me that all across this globe, we have not matured enough to have honest conversations about managed retreat. People won't have the conversation. It's like dead on arrival. You can't even talk about it. I love the work that I do, and I'm thankful to be in this role, and I'm grateful for the space that I'm in. But I was very clear when I took this job that I would never step down as a pastor, because from my perspective, there are still hard truths that need to be said and spaces that need to be created to help people face those hard truths that political spaces usually are not good at. They're just not good at helping people hear hard things, face them, take them in, and ask, how do we rebuild? How do we create a new story of us, which is actually the task that we have in this moment.
That's the key.
And I don't think, I believe in the power of government. I'm not anti-government. I'm not saying small government. What I'm saying is that visionary work to help us create a new story of us is work that I hope more faith institutions will have. It's work that I hope more arts institutions will have. Because while I try to lead in my government work, I still do believe the most powerful force that will move us is love. And you do not fight for things that you do not love. And the way that politics tends to orient that love can often be misguided. So I know that we need sectors that exist outside of government, outside of business, that can orient people's hearts in a way that allow them to show up differently, allow them to imagine themselves being something that they maybe can't even imagine in this moment. The centrality of that maturation, that evolution, that us rising to the occasion is really, really key. And so I do the work I do in government, love it. I also have clarity about where it brings things and where it has limitations.
We're running out of time. So just to come back to this last question, environmental justice is central to any conversation about climate change. And it's central to some of the questions that we've been talking about. And on this question of parallels between this film, Don't Look Up, and our decision to continue building on a neighborhood of glass towers at sea level, on landfill, along the coast, in the bullseye of rising sea levels. The question is, who covers the costs when the flooding eventually comes? And who should we expect to pay to protect it if we're going to take measures to build berms and barriers in advance of those storms? So I wonder, is it fair that the people of Roxbury and the people of Charlestown and the people of Jamaica Plain and other neighborhoods in Boston should be paying for the decision for developers to spend billions of dollars and for our taxpayer money to build up the infrastructure to protect that neighborhood?
I mean, I think my life speaks for itself on where I stand on that question. I think I grew up with the notion that to whom much is given, much is required, and that those who have privilege should go first, always, in carrying the greatest burden. So if there's a burden to be borne, it has to be on the backs of those who have made so much money in this city that they have literally displaced people that I knew that grew up here and who are now living in Randolph and Brockton. Not to knock those communities, but they did not move there because they just wanted to. They moved there because they no longer could afford to live in this city because they have been priced out. And I certainly know those who have not benefited from this boom should not be the ones bailing out those who've made billions.
That is a powerful, I think, note to end on here. Is there anything I haven't asked Ron or Rev Maria that you would like to add as a sort of closing statement? And then we should probably say goodbye.
I'll go first. We're talking here around and through the fact that we have a significantly failed political system with profound imbalances coming up all the time. Those with wealth have outsized representation and they're leveraging it. A, B. I think the thing that we mentioned just in the last few minutes is story. I mean, this is a story machine between our ears. And we really only make sense of the world through stories. We are suffering in this, I think, in this country from what I would call a failure of imagination, which often kills civilizations. And we are at a moment now, as Mariama says, in which we need a new story or many stories that help us see forward. And that's a big part of what Adam and I are about. That's what I do in my life. I find stories, I write them in my books and in my films. And we are at a crisis now where we desperately need that story or stories to help us see how we are up ahead, how we move forward in some kind of unison to our own greater good and frankly, survival. That's the challenge to the creatives, challenge to the storytellers everywhere. So that's what brings us here today. We did that in our movie. We'll do more of it, but it's what Mariama does. It's David, what you do. It's what I think we all do when we are at our best.
Well, I will start with two quick things, which is one of my favorite stories that motivates me, inspires me, is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. If you haven't read it, now's a great time. And second, I think we need a climate comedy hour. So I'm hoping somebody on here is gonna like imagine that. I will be there. Half climate comedy hour, half climate karaoke. I'm there. You tell me.
Have your agent call my agent. Let's get this over with. I mean, it's happening right here on the air.
I am like all for it. This is awesome. I think we should like create like a weekly series of this conversation. This has been great. You guys have been fantastic. Thank you to the Globe. I mean, like if I could have like this dream of two people who I'd want to bring together to have a conversation about these issues, this is just magic. So thank you everybody for joining us. Rev Mariama, Ron, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being with us. Rev, please take care of your ankle, and I hope I see you on your feet soon. All right, we are apparently having to turn this back to the Museum of Science for some closing remarks. Thank you both.
Thank you to the Boston Globe for convening this wonderful community conversation about a great film, a film that challenges us to look up, to realize that at the end of the day, reality will get the last word, and that it is our job to work together to solve the problems we face, knowing that among the things it means to be human is to have that innovative ability to solve problems. Science and technology gives us the tools to do that very thing, to show the capacity that humans have to use science and technology to create a better future, a better community, and a better world. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening.